Last weekend, my wife made a quick trip to Publix. And after getting her shopping cart on her way into the store, she was horrified to see an older lady just ahead of her with her skirt folded up in the back so that the backside of her underwear was exposed. And the lady's husband was a few steps ahead of her, so he was as oblivious to the predicament as she was. And my wife, for just a couple of moments, wasn't quite sure what she should do. On the one hand, if she says something to the lady, she's obviously going to embarrass her, and she doesn't want to do that. But on the other hand, Kelly knew that if she goes about her business and just goes on with her shopping and lets this lady walk through the store this way, eventually she's going to find out. Eventually someone's going to figure it out and say something. She's going to be far more embarrassed. So Kelly discreetly sidled up next to the lady and just whispered to her to check her skirt. And the lady, no doubt a little embarrassed, was thankful, as she was at least spared far greater embarrassment had she wandered much further into the store unaware of her clothing malfunction. So what do you think? Did my wife do the right thing? Yes? I think so too. I think she did the right thing. But doing the right thing wasn't necessarily easy for her. She didn't want to embarrass this lady. So it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't the easy thing to do. And doing the right thing is not always the easy thing to do, is it? Sometimes doing the right thing is kind of a difficult thing to do. I'm going to ask if you would turn once again to 1 Samuel chapter 2. I say once again because if you remember, on Mother's Day, we were in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2 as we considered the example of Hannah. This morning, on Father's Day, we're going to consider the example of a father whose name was Eli. You might remember from Mother's Day that Eli was a priest who had two sons. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas, and we're going to focus on Eli's relationship with his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and we're going to consider how, as a father, he missed the mark. Now, I was reminded recently that I use a lot of what do I call it? Idioms. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. I use a lot of idioms in my preaching, so I just decided I'm going to start giving idioms that I'm going to give my sermons titles that are idioms, okay? And that's what this is. This is missing the mark is an idiom that basically means that we don't do things quite right. If the bullseye is doing it the right way, and we miss that mark by not doing it the right way, kind of missing out on that. And Eli, as a father, he missed the mark. He didn't do it quite the right way. And in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 22 through 26, we see the beginning of that story. It says in those verses 22 through 26, "Now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, 'Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?' But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man." In these verses I just read, we find that Eli rebuked his sons. Eli rebuked his sons. And you might say, well, Pastor Mike, understanding what these sons have done, wasn't rebuking them the right thing to do? How can you say that he missed the mark when he did probably the exact thing that he should have done? They needed to be rebuked, right? And so how can we say that he missed the mark? All that's true. Eli did rebuke his sons, and that was the right thing to do, but I want you to see that his rebuke was late. His rebuke was late. Yes, he rebuked Hophni and Phinehas, but his rebuke came far too late in their life. There are some key pieces of evidence in these verses that will prove that assertion. The first bit of evidence is found in verse 22, where we read that Eli was very old. We don't know exactly how old he was at this point. We just know he was very old. We also know if you look ahead at chapter 4, verse 15, we will find out that Eli was 98 years old when he died. That would be a number of years later into the future when he died. We know he was 98 when he died, and that here in 1 Samuel chapter 2, he is very old. So he's somewhere between very old and 98. All right, that gives us as much of a guess as we could come up with. My best guess is probably chapter 2 probably takes place like 15 to 20 years prior to chapter 4. So that would put Eli somewhere in his late 70s to early 80s here in chapter 2. So now that we have established the fact that someone in their late 70s is very old. Was I not supposed to say that out loud? Bad pastor, don't say things like that. All right, but now that we know that he's very old, I want you to understand that it's late in life for him to be rebuking his sons. And we obviously we can't know that he never rebuked them before, but we see evidence in their lives, namely their very selfish behavior, that tells us that they had not been told no a whole lot in their lifetime. Another bit of evidence to support this assertion that the rebuke came late is seen still in verse 22, where we read that he kept hearing. He kept hearing all that his sons were doing. Why did he have to keep hearing it? Why did he have to hear it more than once? I'm here to tell you right now that if someone came and accused one of my kids of gross misconduct, I wouldn't have to hear that accusation more than once to deal with it. I would go to my child. Now, I wouldn't necessarily believe or assume that the accusation is accurate, but I would deal with it. I'd go to my child and try to ascertain the facts and find out, is there anything to this? Is there any truth in this at all? And if there is, then we need to deal with it. If there's not, then we need to set the record straight and make sure that everybody understands what the truth of the matter is. But here Eli, he keeps hearing it. Why did he wait so long to address this in his son? And I think the fact is that Eli, as he keeps hearing it, he did not like to confront sin in the lives of his two sons. He wasn't a big fan of rebuking them or telling them no, and their actions stand as evidence to that point. Let's talk about the actions of these sons. The behavior reveals a deep level of selfishness in their hearts as they engaged in sexual intimacy with women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. I trust that I don't have to tell you this, but you know that this is immoral. These are women to whom they were not married. That makes it immoral. They were sleeping with women in the plural. They were involved in this gross sexual immorality, and everybody knew about it, and everybody's talking about it, and it was all they're taking advantage of these women to satisfy their own selfish carnal desires, and it was just a blight on Israel. This was something that was wrong and on so many levels, and it was such a heartbreaking thing. We don't know a lot about these women who were serving at the tent. If you go to Exodus chapter 38, verse 8, we'll find, I think we've got that verse, Exodus 38, verse 8, talks about the women who would serve at the tent. Now, this was Exodus 38, verse 8, goes all the way back to the days of Moses. So we're talking generations before Eli and his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. But going back, we find that there were women who were serving or worshiping at the tent. And in Exodus 38, we find that they were sacrificing. The basin that the craftsmen for the tabernacle, they used the bronze mirrors, it says. The Egyptians, they would have gotten these mirrors in Egypt. The Egyptians used this highly polished bronze, like probably a plate of some kind, and they would use that for a mirror, not a glass mirror like we would think of a mirror, but this highly polished bronze would act as the mirror. But these women had those. They got them from Egypt. Remember, when they left Egypt, they got all kinds of treasures from the Egyptians, and so they took those and they sacrificed them. They gave them back to the tabernacle, and they were used to create the basin and the stand for the basin there in the tabernacle. And so these women, we don't know a lot about them. There's no order of women who serve at the tabernacle. There's no place in Leviticus that you can read where women were assigned to this duty. But we just know that there were women who were there to worship, who were there to serve, who were there to sacrifice. They were there to honor God, not be taken advantage of by two young priests who had never been told no by their father. Why is it so hard to tell a child no? Any parents ever experienced that? I remember my wife coming home one time from the grocery store looking just a bit frazzled when she came home. And I made the mistake of asking her, I said, "What's wrong?" And she just looked at me and said, "Your son." Why are they always my kids when they misbehave? But she said, "Your son," and she had taken on this occasion. It happened to be Isaac. I think this happened with both. In fact, I know this happened with both of our sons. But on this particular occasion, it was Isaac, and she'd taken Isaac to the grocery store, and she'd put him in the little seat there in the cart, and she's pushing him around, and she made the mistake. It was her fault. She made the mistake of taking him right past the big bin of bouncy balls. All right, some of you are wondering, what in the world is Pastor Mike going to be talking about, a big bin of bouncy balls? Try to say that 5 times in a row really fast. Big bin of bouncy balls, big bin of bouncy balls. But she took him past the big bin of bouncy balls. Any other parents come to hate the big bin of bouncy balls when you go to the store? Anyone else, or is it just us? We hated that big bin of bouncy balls because it's like they design those things to make parents' lives miserable, I think. They just, this big bin of bouncy balls, and it's like this tower of fun for kids and nightmare for parents. And so she took him past the big bin of bouncy balls, and Isaac, who loved the big bin of bouncy balls and always wanted to get a new bouncy ball every time he saw the big bin of bouncy balls, he began to ask for a new bouncy ball. Now, Kelly, she knew that there were probably, 4, 5, 6, 7, 25, 48, how many ever bouncy balls we had in the basement and in the boys' room. And she said, "No, you don't need another bouncy ball." She told him no. You big meanie. She told him no. And Isaac's reaction was, how shall we say, a bit dramatic. Is that a good way of putting it? In other words, he had a temper tantrum and kind of made her life miserable there in the store. And that's why she had the frazzled look on her face when she got home that day. Saying no to our kids isn't always easy, but often it is the right thing to do. The problem is, it seems, that Eli did not tell his boys no. He did not rebuke their bad behavior, at least not until it was too late. And even then, and this is important, even then, all he did was address their behavior. Now, I want you to notice that. When he did rebuke them, all he did was address their behavior, and thus his rebuke was lacking. His rebuke was lacking. It was lacking because all he was focused on was the behavior. Okay? When my back pain got really, really bad, Kelly took me to the ER, and I went to see the doctor. And the doctor, what would you think? Let me ask you this question. If I'd gone in with this really bad back pain, and all the doctor did was say, "Here, I'll give you a prescription for pain medication, and you'd be on your way," what would you think of that doctor? If that's all he did? Just deal with the symptom, right? That wouldn't be very good at all. We don't want to just deal with a symptom. We want to find out, why am I having that pain? What's the source of that pain, and how do we fix that, right? You don't want to just deal with a symptom. You want to get to the root problem and work on solving that. I needed a doctor to, yes, help me with the pain, but I needed x-rays and an MRI to discover a herniated disc, and eventually I would need surgery to remove that disc and fuse 2 vertebrae. Listen, when a parent rebukes his or her child for misbehavior with the hope of correcting or changing or altering that behavior, but ignores the root cause of that misbehavior, then that parent's rebuke is lacking. Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, we read things like evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, and slander come from where? They come from out of the heart, right? So there's a heart issue. You can look at the behavior, the misbehavior, and if you focus on that, and all your only goal is to change that, to alter that behavior, then you're really missing what the root cause is. The root cause is there's a heart issue that needs to be dealt with. The misbehavior isn't the real problem. It's just a symptom of the real problem, which is a sinful heart. So in verse 23, when Eli asks his sons, why do you do such things? He's not dealing with the heart issue. He's dealing with the behavior. He's dealing with what they're doing, and therefore he is missing the mark. That's not the right question for him to be asked. Not why do you do such things? They obviously are doing these things because their hearts are not right. So what is a parent to do? First of all, let me be clear that I am in no way suggesting that parents should ignore misbehavior in their kids. Kids need to learn the right way to behave, and they need to understand that misbehaving is not acceptable and won't be tolerated. So parental rebuke may well be in order at times. But I am also saying that parents must recognize that the misbehavior is a symptom of a bigger problem. When Isaac threw a temper tantrum in the grocery store because his mom wouldn't buy him a bouncy ball from the big bin of bouncy balls, there was a heart issue at play here. We can't just focus on the temper tantrum and say we got to change that, we got to alter that. We got to get to the heart issue. What's at the heart issue? There's sin issues like greed, right? He's already got a bunch of bouncy balls at home. Why does he need a new one? Because the heart is sinful. And because it's greed, it's the sin of greed that's coming out in our little boy. We need to deal with that. It's the sin of selfishness. It's the sin of materialism. It's the sin of discontent. I'm not happy with all those bouncy balls I have at home. I need a new bouncy ball. Then I'll be happy. That's the sin of discontent. We've got to deal with that. There was also the sin of a disregard and disrespect for the authority of his mother that was at play in that situation. So that temper tantrum, it required some immediate rebuke for sure, but what it really showed us is that our son was a depraved little sinner who needed discipleship in his life. We needed to get to the heart of that issue. Where a lot of parents get sidetracked is that they focus on the goal of good behavior in their kids, but good behavior cannot be the goal. Godliness in your kids must always be the goal. Let me say that again. Good behavior cannot be the goal. Godliness in your kids must always be the goal. Do I want my kids to behave well? Of course I do. But of highest importance to me is this, that my kids love the Lord and want to live their lives to His glory. Don't just rebuke misbehavior with the hopes of doing nothing more than changing or altering that behavior. And that can be very tempting to do, isn't it? Why is it we want to alter and change a kid's behavior? I give you two reasons. One is that misbehavior can be annoying, right? Anyone ever get annoyed by misbehavior? Misbehavior can be annoying. Not only that, it can also be embarrassing. Yes? Anyone ever been embarrassed by your kid's misbehavior? Misbehavior can be annoying. misbehavior can be embarrassing. I've shared this story with you before, but it's just too good. I gotta share it one more time. Probably won't be the last time, but I'm going to share it with you again now. Long time ago, we were in a store with our kids. Why did we ever take our kids to the store? Like, it never turned out well. But we were in the store with our kids, and we were in a Meijer. Okay, if you're from the Midwest, you know what Meijer is. If you're not, it's like Meijer, but way better. Okay, it's like Walmart, but way better. But Meijer is we were in the Meijer, and we were way in the back of the Meijer. And it's about as far away from the exits as you could get. And one of our kids, I won't tell you which one it was, but she started to have a meltdown. All right, and I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, I'm going to go give her $1 after the service. But you should know that we're in negotiations. If you're going to keep giving her money when I mention her name, we're just going to sign a contract. I'm going to just keep mentioning her name, and we're going to split the money. So you might want to hold on to your money. I'm just kidding. We wouldn't really do that to you. But anyway, so she starts having this meltdown. And so I said, well, what I need to do is remove her from the situation. That's what you got to do. You got to remove your kid from that situation. That's all the parenting books say that, and I knew that, and so I'm going to do the right thing here. And so I took her up into my arms. I think she had also been in the seat of the cart, and I took her up, and I told Kelly, I said, we'll wait for you out in the car. Big mistake. I'm walking to the exit to get out to the parking lot, to get to the car. Remember, we're way in the back of the store, all right, as far away from the exit as you can get. So I'm walking from the back of the store all the way to the front to get to the exit with this inconsolable child who is having this meltdown and who is screaming over and over and over again, I want my mommy. I want my mommy. Now, if you're not familiar with my daughter, you should know that she doesn't exactly bear the family resemblance, okay? If you look at us, you can't really see that family resemblance. So I want you to get that picture in your mind. Here's this guy that looks like me. That was back in the day, that picture there. But it was a guy that looks like me carrying a little girl that looks like her through the store, and she's screaming, I want my mommy, I want my mommy. You think I was annoyed by that? Absolutely. You think I was embarrassed by that? Oh boy, I got to tell you, I was embarrassed, especially when we got out in the parking lot and a lady stopped us. And she had to make sure that I wasn't abducting this child, which, give her credit, was the right thing to do. But boy, was it embarrassing to go through that. It would be very tempting because the behavior is annoying and because it's embarrassing. It would be very tempting to just focus on the behavior and say, what do we have to do to alter the behavior here? What do we have to do to change that behavior in this child? But as frustrated, as annoyed, as embarrassed as I was, I had to understand that there is a deeper heart issue at play here, which in that situation, as I recall, was a sibling relationship kind of issue, again with Isaac. It was always Isaac's fault for some. He was just always at play here, but I don't know. He had been egging her on, and now her response was wrong, and what he was doing was wrong, and we had to deal with that. We had to get at the heart issue of our kids and deal with it. We had to do some discipleship. You can't just focus on the rebuke and say, don't act that way, don't behave that way. You have to get to the heart issue and see, what is it? What's the sin issue? What's the issue? What's the opportunity for teaching and discipleship here for my child that we can have and make a difference in this child's life? Eli focused on rebuke for misbehavior because he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed at what others were saying. He kept hearing it. Not only that, if you look at verse 23, it says, verse 24, it says that this isn't just something that people keep repeating to me, but it's being spread abroad. It's like everybody's hearing about this. This is going beyond the borders of Israel. Everybody knows about this. And he's embarrassed by the behavior, and so he addresses the behavior. But he kind of missed the heart issue. Now, I give him some credit. In verse 25, he does try to deal with their hearts by reminding them that they would have no mediator to defend them when they're sinning against God like this. But notice that his sons did not listen. His sons did not listen. We see in verse 25, they did not listen because it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. In other words, they were out of second chances. Their lot was cast by the Lord because of the years of habitual and willful sin and rebellion. If only their father had spoken up sooner. If only he had told them no. If only he had sought to disciple their hearts and not just try to adjust their annoying or embarrassing behavior. A couple of thoughts before we move on. First of all, to our dads here this morning, your kids need a godly father in their lives. And I'm not just talking about the guys who have young kids still living at home. Hophni and Phinehas were grown men, but boy, did they ever need a godly father. Your kids, even if they're all grown up, They may yet need rebuke for sinful, selfish behavior, but for sure your kids, no matter what age they are, what stage of life they are, your kids need your love, and they need you to continue to invest yourself in their spiritual life, in their spiritual growth. You know, we hear a lot about absentee fathers today and the problems that phenomenon is causing in our world, but please understand that you can be close at hand. You can even live in the same house, yet still be an absentee father if you're not investing in the hearts of your kids. By that same token, I do believe that you can be separated by thousands of miles and still invest spiritually in the lives of your kids. At least I hope that's true, because we're separated by thousands of miles by our sons. Dads, ask yourself the question, what am I doing to disciple the hearts of my kids? And if you can't think of anything, then I want to challenge you to start with two things. I want to challenge you to start with praying with your kids. Something really simple you can do, just pray with your kids. The second thing is read a passage of Scripture with them every day, at least a few times a week, and discuss that with them, and make it your goal to make disciples for Jesus of your children. The second thought I want to share in relation to all this is directed to those who have fathers, especially those who have fathers who are still alive. Hophni and Phinehas did not listen to their father. And that's too bad, because while he was a little late in getting around to it, he did have some worthwhile instruction for them in verse 25, but they wouldn't listen. My dad passed away 17 and a half years ago, but if you're still blessed to have your father, can I urge you to listen to him? In the book of Proverbs, we read over and over again the instruction to listen to and hear a father's instruction. Yes, there are always exceptions, but generally speaking, a father, especially a godly father, always wants what's best for his children. So I want to urge you to try this week to remember one or two sage pieces of advice from your father. And if applicable, apply that advice to your life, and thus honor your father. If you can't think of any pieces of advice from your father, and if your father is still alive, then ask him. You just ask him this question: what is one piece of advice you think I should know in life? What a neat way to honor your dad. I don't want to spend a lot of time on verse 26, but we do in that verse, we find a sharp contrast to Hophni and Phinehas. You got Hophni and Phinehas here who are facing the judgment of God. They wouldn't listen because God had already determined to put them to death. I mean, their lot is set. They're facing that impending judgment. But in contrast to that, there's Samuel. Samuel was growing both physically and spiritually and found favor in God's eyes. Eli rebuked his sons. In doing so, he missed the mark because, first of all, he was just late in getting around to that rebuke. But he also missed the mark because he focused more on their poor behavior than on their hearts. But that's not the only way that Eli missed the mark. Look at verses 27 through 29. There it says, "And there came a man of God to Eli and said to him, 'Thus says the Lord, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Did I choose him out of the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel.'" Just read that last sentence again. "I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel." Take note of that. Verse 29, "Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel?" Here we find that Eli failed to be a godly role model. He failed to be a godly role model to his sons. Point number 2. This unnamed man of God shows up. Verses 27 and 28, he reminds Eli of his heritage. He's talking about Aaron, the first priest that God called even back when the people were still in Egypt. God had called Aaron to be that intermediary connection between God and his people, and it would be the Aaronic line that would be the priestly line in Israel. And so Eli, being a descendant of Aaron, is reminded of that by this man of God. He comes and says to him, "Did I not call your father when they were still in Egypt and they were still subject to Pharaoh? They were still slaves there in Egypt." He says, "Did I not choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to burn the incense and to wear the ephod," all the things that the priest did there. And then he says, "And I gave to your father the offerings by fire from the people." In other words, God provided from the sacrifices. Excuse me. God provided from the sacrifices that the people brought the food for Aaron and his family. That's how they got their food. That's how their lives were sustained, was by taking the meat from those offerings. And that's what this man of God is pointing out to Eli here, as he reminds him of his heritage. But then in verse 29, we read about a spiritual failure on the part of Eli. He had scorned the sacrifices and the offerings. Notice the man of God accuses Eli of honoring his 2 sons above God by fattening himself on the choicest parts of every offering given by the people of Israel. And you say, well, what's that? What's he talking about? What's this man of God talking about? To understand that, and we understand it within the context of this chapter, we got to go back and read some verses that we did not read earlier. And I did that by design, because I want us to go back and look at verses 12 through 17 right now. So look back at 1 Samuel chapter 2, same chapter we're in, but look at verses 12 through 17. "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men." Those are God's words, by the way. Let that sink in for a moment. Those are God's words. "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. The custom of the priests with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest servant would come while the meat was boiling, with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up would be the priest the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned, and the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, 'Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw.' And if the man said to him, 'Let them burn the fat first, Then take as much as you wish. He would say, no, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force. Thus, the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. In Leviticus chapter 7, God gives the priests of Israel some very specific instructions for how they were to go about making sacrifices. And those instructions included the portions of the sacrifice that were to be given to the priests. The priests were to receive these portions for themselves as food. We read that in Leviticus chapter 7, verses 31 and 32. We read that the breast meat was for the priests, and also the right thigh was for the priest, and they could keep that for themselves for food. Those were the cuts of meat that were for the priests. Okay? Now, I want you to understand that what we read here in 1 Samuel chapter 2 is rather unusual, and I highlighted the fact that what we're reading about in verse 13, it says it's the custom of the priests. That's an important little statement. There's the custom of the priests. Everything we're reading here about the boiling of the meat and the three-pronged fork and all that was the custom of the priests, not the law of God. So don't get that confused. What was happening in Shiloh was not what God prescribed for the sacrifices in the temple. This was the custom of the priests to do this, and what they would do is they would put the meat in some sort of cauldron or pot, they would boil it, and then they would come with this three-pronged fork, and the meat was cooked down. Have you ever had like a pot roast? And it looks like one big piece of meat until you put a fork in it, and it just kind of shreds and comes apart. And that's the idea here. Whatever sticks to that three-pronged fork, that was their custom. There's the custom of the priest, not the law of the Lord. But the custom was that would be what they would take for food. But then we come to verse 15. Look at verse 15. The first word in that verse is moreover. In other words, it's like it's saying, not only that, here's the custom of the priests. This is what they're doing. This is what they did in Shiloh. But not only that, you've got Hophni and Phinehas, who were identified here in verse 15 as the priest's servant. Okay? Who was the priest? Eli. Okay? And so his servant is talking about their sons here. His sons, Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, are the servants. So moreover, not only is there this custom of the priest that's not really prescribed by God, but even beyond that, as though that's not bad enough, to make it far worse. That's what the word moreover is kind of telling us. As though this custom of the priest isn't bad enough, it gets worse. The servant, the priest's servant, talking about Hophni and Phinehas here, would come and say to the people who are making the sacrifice, give meat for the priest to roast. In other words, give meat for my dad. Give meat for Eli to roast. And they were taking the choicest parts, and they were taking the fat. Here's the problem. In Leviticus chapter 7, verse 31, it becomes crystal clear that when the priests are making the sacrifice, there's different things that they're supposed to do with different parts of the body of this animal in this particular sacrifice. But one thing is very clear, is that the fat was to be burned up on the altar to God. And so that's why the people are saying, at least let the fat be burned up. The people knew better than the priests did what was supposed to be happening in the sacrifice. At least let the fat be burned up on the altar first. They're asking for that. This is my sacrifice. I want it to be pleasing to God. At least let the fat be burned up. And what are Hophni and Phinehas saying? They're saying, no way. We don't want boiled meat. We want raw meat. Just give me the whole thing, and I'm going to take it, and I'm going to we're going to roast it up, and this is going to be our dinner. If I have to, we'll take it by force, they say. Verse 16. And in verse 17, we see that their sin was very great before the Lord. It's no wonder. In verse 12, they're called worthless men. Again, those are God's words, not mine. And if all we read was verses 12 through 17, we'd have to conclude that the sin here was the sin of Hophni and Phinehas. And it was their sin alone. But when we read verse 29, when the man of God comes to Eli, we look at verse 29 and we find out that Eli, their father, the priest, knew what his sons were doing. He knew what the right thing to do was. He knew what the wrong thing to do was. He knew what his sons were doing. He knew that the meat that the sons were bringing to the table was not only ill-gotten meat, but meat that was supposed to be burned up on the altar for the glory of God. And it says that Eli honored his sons above God by eating that meat. In other words, I know what God wants, and I know what my sons are doing. I know that if I eat this meat, I'm going to honor what my sons are doing. I'm going to give approval to what my sons are doing. I should honor God. I should insist that things be done appropriately and according to God's design and that God gets the glory. That should be what I'm doing, but that's not what he does. Why? Well, it says in verse 29 that he did it to fatten himself, right? It says, you honor your sons above me by fattening yourself on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel. That idea there of fattening is both literal and figurative. If you go to chapter 4, right before Eli dies, or at the time of his death, actually, in chapter 4, verse 18, we find out that when he died, he fell over in his chair, his neck was broken, he died. It says, for the man was old and heavy. My takeaway from that is you can be overweight and still live to 98. So there's good news for me. But I'm just kidding, that's not my takeaway. So there's a literal thing to that he was literally fattening himself. But that idea of fattening himself really has the idea, it kind of carries the idea of greed, the sin of greed. And that's what we see in Eli here, that he had a choice. I can take the meat that my sons are bringing to the table and we can roast it and we can eat it, even though I know it's not the right thing to do. Or I can insist that God be glorified, that the fat be burned up, that everything be done as God prescribed, and I can do it to his glory. There's the choice he had to make. Why didn't he make the right choice? Because it was the choicest cuts, the choicest meat. He wanted it for himself. It was greed. There's gluttony, the sin of gluttony as well, but really it's what we really see here is the sin of greed. The sin of greed shows through the pious exterior that he hoped that others would see. He probably knew that his sons could see through it, but he probably hoped that others couldn't. But here comes this man of God who testifies to everything he's done, and Eli realizes that he hasn't been consistent. He hasn't been that consistent, godly, righteous role model that his sons needed him to be. Fathers, God calls on us to rebuke sin in our kids. But unlike Eli, if you are going to rebuke their sin, you better make sure that you're not embracing sin in your own life, because they'll see the hypocrisy. That's one thing the kids can do. They can see that hypocrisy. Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 through 5, Jesus reminds us to get the timber out of our own eye before pointing out the speck of sawdust in the eyes of others. Dads, let us strive together as brothers in Christ to be consistent in our walks with Christ, holding one another accountable and encouraging in each other godliness and holiness. And let me just take this opportunity to give a little commercial for our men's ministry. The Sons of Encouragement. That's what we call ourselves, the Sons of Encouragement. And that's sort of based on Barnabas in Acts chapter 4, who his real name was Joseph, but they called him Barnabas because it means son of encouragement. And that's what he was. He was an encourager. And I want each of us as men in this church to encourage one another. Not to judge one another, but to encourage one another. Not to look down on one another, but to love one another. I want us to hold each other accountable so that we can be consistent in our walks with Christ. Right now, we're studying this book, The Hole in Our Holiness, and it's challenging us as men to strive after godliness and holiness. And I want to encourage you, if you've not been a part of our men's ministry, June 29th, a week from Tuesday, will you come? Will you be here? Will you be a part of that? Let's let this ministry grow so that we as men in the church can hold one another accountable in love, to encourage one another, not to judge one another. Here's the thing, guys. Whenever I come to the men's ministry and we get there and we sit around the table and I look around the table at all the men, I know that I'm looking at a bunch of sinful men. And when they look at me, they know they're looking at a sinful man. We know that about each other. We don't need to judge one another. We need to love one another. We need to encourage one another. And that's what I want for the men in this church, to just be that source of encouragement and accountability and love for one another. Dads, let's strive to be consistent in our walks with Christ so that we can be consistent in discipling our kids. Recently, I corrected one of our kids for a wrong attitude that she had. Sadly, she was able to say to me immediately, "But Dad, what about?" I won't tell you what she said because that'd be embarrassing to me, but she basically pointed out a bad attitude in my life that I had made very evident to her. She saw it. She saw the hypocrisy. You're going to tell me to have a good attitude when you've got this attitude? And, it kind of stunned me. Part of me just wanted to say, just be quiet and just, do what I say, not what I do. But I had to say, you know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. And that's wrong for me to have that attitude. And I need to change. But so do you. Let's work on that together. Let's change that together. We need to be consistent role models in our lives. You ever been there? You ever been there where you call someone out on their sin and they're able to turn it right back on you? I suspect that we probably have all been there because the fact is we're all sinners. The Bible tells us that we all sin and that none of us is perfect. God doesn't demand perfection from us. He just demands consistency, the pursuit of holiness. And thankfully, the consistent pursuit of holiness is possible for us. It's possible because Jesus, God's eternal Son, became a part of humanity. In the incarnation, God became man so that he is fully God and fully human. Because he's fully God, his life is perfect and free from all sin. Because he is human, he has the ability to suffer, to bleed, to die. And when he was nailed to the cross, he did that. He suffered, he bled, and he died on that cross. And he did that to offer his perfect life as payment for our sinful, wretched lives. There wasn't one thing that any of us could ever do to make payment for our sin, but Jesus did it all. Jesus paid it all. And because he had no sin, because his life was perfection, and because death is the consequence of sin, death had no claim on him. Death couldn't contain him. Death couldn't hold on to him. He rose again on the third day, victorious over sin, victorious over death. And his resurrection proves to us that what he did on the cross was sufficient payment for our sin. And so all who believe in him, all who put their trust in Jesus, can have their sin forgiven and wiped away. Romans chapter 6 talks about the body of sin being brought to nothing. It's abolished, it's obliterated when we put our faith and trust in Jesus. And if our sin is brought to nothing, and if we are in the righteousness of Jesus Christ, Then there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And we have the hope of eternity with him. Isn't that great? The question is, do you believe? Question right now that you have to answer. If you've never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, you just have to answer this question. Do I believe this? Am I ready to put my faith and trust? Am I ready to stop trying myself? Am I ready to stop trying to be good enough? Am I ready to turn away from my sin and turn to the Savior in faith and believe in him? Are you ready? If you are, tell him that right now. And if you wouldn't mind, please tell me before you leave here today. If you're watching the live stream, if you watch this at some point in the future down the road, and if this is that moment that you're ready to put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, please let us know. Leave a comment and let us know right now. We'd love to hear from you. Let me just wrap this up by saying to all our godly fathers, thank you for your love and your presence in the lives that God has gifted to you as fathers. Thank you, and happy Father's Day.